New Patreon, check it out. Thank you. Jesus Christ, here we go. Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the debut album from Calvin Harris. I Created Disco. Oh boy, Calvin Harris. This is going to be one of those discography reviews I'm doing less because I'm going to have a lot of fun or please lots of people, but more because I just gotta get it out of my system. See, I've talked about this guy more than a few times when I do the year-end hits lists, and every time I've made it clear that in general, I really do not like this guy. But it's also started to get to the point where it's becoming less believable that I don't like him, because so far I haven't gotten the chance to actually talk about something from him that I don't like. Every opportunity I've gotten to talk about him was on my best hits lists. He's made it onto the list all 3 years I've made them so far, and spoilers, it's gonna be 4 years. Yeah, One Kiss is such a ridiculously great track for me that not only is it guaranteed a spot on the best hits list, right now it also probably has the best shot at topping it. Even though it's only June right now, so something is still liable to come in and save me from that embarrassment. Yeah, the idea of Calvin Harris not only making 4 of my top 10 best hits lists in a row, but also maybe even topping 2 of them, that's scary. So I think now is as good a time as any to go into detail why I keep saying that I don't like this guy and often put him in the same breath as David Guetta, calling him the Burger King of electronic music to Guetta's McDonald's. At this point, I can't hold back anymore. I have to talk about this guy in detail for my own mental health. And of course, we are going to start with his debut album, I Created Disco. Now, some people who have heard this album are going to be like, oh, hang on, this is going to be just like your Just a Little More Love review, isn't it? Because Calvin Harris's first album is generally considered to be really good and is not indicative at all of what he would become later down the line. And you know, if you do really like this album, I won't fault you for it. I understand the appeal, but God, I do not like this album at all. I mean, I will give it credit for being more entertaining and interesting than his later stuff, which was just bland and boring. He's able to put together an effective dance groove. On top of that, he actually does have more of a personality. Yeah, I can understand why people like this, but for me, I typically find this album painfully derivative with mediocre production, and Calvin Harris as a frontman has never been more punchable than he was here. At its best moments, it's fine. Unless it's some minor foot tapping, I find myself mildly enjoying it. I don't feel like the entire album is a complete waste of my time. But at its worst moments, it's really, really bad. It elicits my entire body just tensing up in disgust. So let's talk about it. I guess we gotta talk about the beginning here first. And yeah, this album starts out so far in the negative that it basically had no chance of recovering after that. I freaking hate merrymaking at my place, and it is a major linchpin in the issues I have with this album. Because as mentioned previously, I think this album is very derivative. Calvin Harris has sights on one specific artist who he's trying to emulate, and that's LCD Sound System. The entire album, he is trying his absolute hardest to be like James Murphy, most blatantly on this first track where he talks about all the various things going on in his house, ending every line with my house. Those are people come to my house, they take stuff inside of my house. Does that sound familiar?
That punk is playing at my house, my house.
Now I will admit that I do happen to love LCD Sound System, and that, okay, at least you're emulating a good artist, but my freaking god, Calvin Harris is not James Murphy. This dude is trying really hard to sound cool, and nearly every inflection in his voice is just so cringeworthy. But especially whenever he tries to sing in falsetto. At my place, baby, at my place. Sparking up my neon rocks. I keep my secret stash in the God, his voice sounds so bad all over the album. The closest he comes to tolerable with his falsetto is This Is the Industry, because at least he's like covered in reverb and kind of in the background. But even then, the lyrics are so lazy that it becomes distracting. He repeatedly just talks about being in the industry. Well, not even, he doesn't really even talk about it. He just says, you're in the industry, I'm in the industry, we're in the industry. After a while it becomes less about the music industry and more about sitting in a tree planted next to the Indus River in India. This album is so incredibly brainless, like you wouldn't believe. I mean, geez, at least James Murphy could be smart or clever or funny. Calvin Harris doesn't even try for any of that. Well, okay, he tries. If there's anything that might be trying to be funny, I guess given the title of the album, he is trying to be funny there. Because you look at that title, and the first thing you think is, no, Calvin Harris, you did not freaking invent disco in 2007. And then on top of that, you actually hear the album, and there's no disco anywhere on here. He's not even aiming for the 70s at all, save for maybe Love Souvenir, and even then, he's pretty off. But yeah, for the most part, you want to guess what decade he's trying to emulate on this album? I wonder what decade he might be taking influence from here.
The 80s, the 80s.
No, I've got no idea. But I do know that this album is way too rough and electro-infused to pass itself off as disco. I mean, I think that's the joke that Calvin Harris is trying for here, because the actual title track samples some guy who talks about inventing disco in the mid-70s, before Harris was even born. That is Calvin Harris's attempt at being clever, taking his album full of electro house inspired by the 1980s, the decade where disco was most dead, and naming it after his taking credit for a genre that he A, didn't invent, or B, even really tried to make in the first place, and wouldn't actually go on to make it all until just last year. That's so hilarious. But yeah, going on from there, I think the parts that piss me off the most is probably when he talks about girls and having sex and stuff, which, you know, always fun. He gets all the girls. He gets all the girls. He even gets the mixed race girls, and sounds pretty awkward while name dropping them. In Disco Heat, he talks about his foreplay, which just... when he goes to Vegas, he brings his girls, his boys, and his girls. Ha 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 ha. And he brings his car, his ride, and his wheels. So his car, and his car, which is nice. See, I think I've well established by this point that the vocal presence of Calvin Harris himself is by far the biggest weak point of this album. His complete lack of charisma, his bad singing and annoying voice, his incredibly low-level lyricism, in a genre that doesn't even require effort in lyrics in the first place. He ruins whatever appeal the majority of this album could have had for me. Now, if you were to remove him entirely from this album, well, it still wouldn't be great, but it would at least be decent. The production on this album, it's pretty cheap. You can tell one guy put it all together on his little Amiga computer, and it's sonically like a step below the first LCD Sound System album, like if every track on there sounded like Tribulations. Now, okay, I will admit Tribulations is kind of my favorite track from the first LCD Sound System album. And yeah, Calvin Harris can at least consistently deliver on the same sense of groove that track delivers. Instrumentally, it's cheap, but it's competent. And the hooks are generally pretty alright. There are a couple of tracks where the sound can get kind of annoying, most notably the title track. Don't really like the way that one sounds. And everything is really repetitive. For example, Acceptable in the 80s, it basically just has the one hook, and it just repeats over and over and over for 5.5 minutes. There's, like, nothing to it. Yet somehow it's just catchy enough to get away with it. I don't hate the track. Other tracks that have a more interesting instrumental are able to get along better, like This Is the Industry, which had this pretty nice, like, obviously Giorgio-inspired breakdown at one point. There's the interludes, like Traffic Cops, which has a little mild instrumental flavor, like a Boards of Canada interlude without any subtlety. Or Vault Character, which is 4 notes played on a guitar. Okay, that one doesn't actually add anything. But whatever. I will also have to admit the last couple of tracks on here are definitely the best ones. Disco Heat, aside from the foreplay line, which just drives me up the wall, develops a pretty solid and catchy groove once Harris actually shuts up. And Certified and Love Souvenir, they're both actual instrumentals, and decently enjoyable and interesting ones too. Certified just kind of sounds like other tracks on here, a bit slower, slightly more detailed. But Love Souvenir actually comes close to sounding like actual disco. It comes close. I mean, the beat is way too lumpy and awkward to be danceable. It's just the beat is going like... But, you know, the little wah-wah guitars in the background do sound like they have a 70s tinge to them. I do actually think that track's fine, too. I mean, it's a weird one that's aimed at disco and did not hit. But, you know, it's not like any other track I've heard before. I mean, I don't think I need another track that sounds like it, but it's unique. I like it. But the best track on the album is definitely the last one, Electro Man. The Electro sounds with his kind of romantic piano progression is actually kind of charming. And Calvin Harris himself is actually tolerable on this one too. He thankfully stays in his lower register and delivers lyrics which, okay, aren't smart, but they don't make me feel like I'm losing brain cells. It almost sounds like he's actually feeling something on this track, instead of sounding like a tryhard like everywhere else on the album. Yeah, it's tracks like these which prevent me from saying this album is really, truly terrible. But Electro Man, while I think it's a good track, it's not an amazing one, and the best tracks on here are just not good enough to redeem the worst ones on here. Yeah, while this album has some good qualities that I can see why people might be drawn to it, I can't in good faith actually recommend this album to anyone. I can give you 3 albums released in that same year that aim somewhere similar but are so much more worth your time. Why not try LCD Soundsystem's Sound of Silver? Get the genuine article instead of his wannabe fan. And on top of that, get him at the top of his game with his most fun and enjoyable set of tracks to date. Or try Justice's Cross. That takes the electro house sounds and presents them in a far more creative and interesting fashion that's even more danceable and investing than this was. Or hell, maybe even try Cut Copies in Ghost Colors. That's an album that drowns itself in 80s, but doesn't feel the need to directly tell you that it's doing so. It also has way better production and a more passable frontman. Okay, I'm admittedly not huge on Cut Copy outside of this one album, but it's much more worth your time than I Created Disco is. Heck, you'd be much better off checking out Calvin Harris's next album, Ready for the Weekend. But we'll get to that in another video. Whatever, cool if other people were able to get more out of I Created Disco. But in my opinion, there's really no reason to check this out unless you're curious to find out where one of the most successful names in EDM right now got his start. I know that now I've gotten all my thoughts out. I am certainly never going to listen to this album again. It has some entertainment value, I will admit, but nah, this album is just a massive joke to me, and I'm overall feeling a solid 4 out of 10. But yeah, of course this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, link in the description if you want to join that list. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today, see you next time.